Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
Exceptionally well. Thank you for asking, Rory. Very grateful to be here. You have tuned in to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. This is episode 205. Rory and I are bringing you three super duper topics today, starting off with Counselling Foundations, where we revisit the strong foundations that form what we build our practice and our training on. And we're today going to be looking at the work of Sigmund Freud and focusing in on the id, the ego, and the superego. And then today in Focus on Self, which is our section where we recognize that we are the heart of our practice as the practitioner, and that focus on self so important, we're going to be looking at personal therapy, either during training or for ongoing therapy as we go through our practice lives. And then in Practice Matters, where we focus on something interesting in the world of counselling, we're going to be looking at counselling training in the United States of America, how that differs from the United Kingdom, where Counselling Tutor and the Counselling Tutor Podcast are based. And Rory met up with Robin Simmons, and we're going to be bringing you that interview with those differences. But let's kick off episode 205 with Sigmund Freud, the id, ego, superego. That's going back a bit, isn't it, Sigmund Freud?
It is. It is going back. Old Shomo Freud, to give him his full name, Sigmund Shomo Freud. And I think the interesting thing about id, ego, superego, it's something that probably most people know about. Most people would know about the ego, I think. If you ask anybody about ego, they know about the ego. But from my perspective, what's really interesting for me is that this is taught in counselling classes, some counselling classes, and I think it's useful to kind of try and get a handle on what is id, ego, superego, because I think sometimes it can be mightily confusing for students. So I like the chocolate cake analogy, and I have borrowed it off somebody. It's not my own, I have to say. I'm plagiarising like crazy here, but if someone offers you a chocolate cake, part of you goes, I want a chocolate cake. I really want a chocolate cake. I want all of the chocolate cake. And then part of you says, hey, eating a lot of chocolate cake isn't really healthy. And maybe you're going to get illnesses, and maybe you're going to put on weight if that concerns you. And, it's not very good, and you should be eating more healthy. And there's a bit preachy, that part of it that's a bit preachy and a bit finger pointy. And then the middle part says, well, look, I'll have one slice of chocolate cake. And with that one slice of chocolate cake, I'll promise I might kind of eat healthily for the rest of the day. And that is a really good example of id, ego, and superego. The id would want to eat all of the cake. The superego is saying to you, you shouldn't eat cake at all. It's a terrible thing to eat. You need to avoid it at all costs. And the ego is kind of that mediating factor in our personalities. It goes, oh, okay, well, I'll just have a little bit of cake, but I'll be moderate with it. The ego really is the meat between the sandwich, Ken.
I like that. Yeah, and I think it's very fitting that in Counselling Foundations we touch on the work of Sigmund Freud. And to be honest, from my own personal perspective, I'm not a fan of all Freud's work, but I do recognize that talking therapy kind of has a very strong root there. If you're a counsellor, a psychotherapist, or you're training in counselling or psychotherapy, we have to give a nod to Freud because he certainly was very influential in starting what is today known as a talking therapy. And it's interesting that we look at the id, the ego, the superego, and I liked that you linked that to chocolate cake. That brought a smile to my face. I'm busy drooling here, thinking, I think that my id is going, yes, chocolate cake. That's a very good idea, that is. So I can feel that processing within me as you speak. And I guess, as you said, Rory, when we come to the word ego, we hear the word ego a lot. And I think maybe sometimes ego is framed as a different meaning to how Freud meant ego. So ego can be misinterpreted as how we appear to others and wanting ourselves to look better. And I guess there's a small link there. But if we look at the id, ego, superego, as they were meant by Freud, there is a slight different meaning, as you said there, Rory. It kind of sits in between the id and the superego. So Freud kind of identified the id as being a biological component and a subconscious component. So we wouldn't be aware of the id. So when we go back to that conscious, the conscious, I'm going to have some chocolate cake there, Rory. The id is the subconscious part of us that would have a drive to eat high-fat, high-sugar foods. And that's why we would be drawn towards that chocolate cake, even if we're not consciously going, oh, I'm going to go and have some chocolate cake. That might come after the biological drive. So it's unseen. It is a subconscious process. And he calls it biological in terms of we're born with it. It's just part of who we are. It's wired into the DNA. And then when we look at the superego, I like starting with the id and then jumping over to the superego. The superego, very much a part of our personality. It's almost like that critical voice within. And I can certainly recognize that in my own life, my own journey. There's a little voice that tells me how I should have done things, how I should do things, what things I should have done, could have done, would have done. Kind of if a process has taken place, I might have this superego that will tell me how I could do it better next time. It's a very judgmental, finger-waggling voice within inside of me. And I do recognize that it's super cautious. It would want to keep me away from any kind of danger, and it makes sense that it would be part of who we are. You know, if I'm starting to walk towards the end of a very high cliff to have a look over and admire the view, my superego will be protesting wildly and saying, nope, you don't want to be going there, keep away from there, don't go there, you're going to fall off, you might fall off, and the voices will be very loud. And then the ego sits right in the middle and balances all out. It's kind of the middle ground, as it were. Really interesting concept.
It is, and I think that in these more enlightened times, we can actually frame it in the frame of culture, because the superego may have a cultural aspect, and we know that some people of faith positions have, say, dietary requirements or faith position requirements that kind of ask them to behave in a certain way to be faithful to their belief system, and it's very possible that the superego may mediate that as well. I think that's an important thing to consider. Also, I guess in terms of our sexuality, the superego may be the finger wagging part of society that tells us that we may not be able to be who we really are.
Yeah,
I think that's quite an interesting angle. But what I'm really fascinated about was a lot of people thought that Freud had actually invented this. And there's a growing body of evidence to say that actually he borrowed the idea from the philosopher Plato. And there's a book called Plato's Republic. And without going too deeply into the philosophical kind of tenets of Platonic character development, Plato talks about us having a kind of three-position part of ourselves. One he calls the charioteer, the one which the man reasons, which may call to the rational principle of the soul, and that's the kind of charioteer going, in a chariot and gung ho and that type of thing. And then the second is sometimes referred to as the ignoble part, which Plato referred to as the irrational or appetitive, I think, the ally of sundry pleasures and satisfactions. That sounds almost rude, doesn't it? And then finally,
hedonistic.
And the third part, Plato refers to it as spirit, the forbidding principle, which is on the side of reason. And there's a growing body of scholars who are thinking that although Freud never mentioned Plato, might have actually borrowed most of those ideas in his own theories.
There you go. I mean, it's really interesting that there's a way of thinking or a concept that nothing is really new. It's just renaming something that was said or thought of before. Interestingly enough, a peer of Sigmund Freud was, of course, Carl Gustav Jung, and
Yes.
he speaks about the universal consciousness, and I think an idea very much frowned upon by Freud, that all ideas exist in kind of a universal soup of consciousness, and they kind of just fall into our minds from time to time. But it's interesting when we look at the world of counselling, the world of psychotherapy, there are similarities, and you kind of tracking the id, ego, superego back to maybe having. And I wouldn't be writing this in your assignment if you're writing about Freud. You can maybe put a possibility there, but I wouldn't be citing Counselling Tutor and say that Freud got his ideas from. This is us kind of discussing and kind of looking at what might be out there and the ideas that are banged about. But the ideas that it may link back to the roots of Plato. And if you look, of course, at transaction analysis, where you have the parent and the adult and the child, similarities there, I might suggest, to id, ego, superego. And even if we look to person-centered therapy, which is a different model altogether, when we look at the concept of the organism itself, or the true self, the self that we're born with, perhaps that is the true self, the id, and maybe with the introjected values, we develop that inner voice that tells us what's right and what's wrong, the superego. And it's interesting how there are similarities in those ideas.
Yes, and I think Byrne really capitalized on the work of Freud, because he talked about the electrode, this spark that sparks our personality into a certain way of thinking that's usually mapped to how our parents think. So I think it's really interesting. But the id, ego, and superego, you're absolutely right, Ken. It's the basis of the beginnings of talking therapy. It's the beginnings of a theory of personality that wasn't wholly biological. There is a biological element to it, but not wholly biological. And it gave us really the roots of phenomenology, the idea that our personalities are developed by how we exist in the world and how we view the world and how the world approaches us. Yeah. So it is a seminal theory, and it's one of those that we do sometimes played out. I'm sure we've seen all the YouTube videos where somebody is really upset in a store because they can't buy the last cake, and they have a meltdown, and they're an adult, and they're saying, why have you run out of cakes? You should have more cakes. We've all seen those videos, those viral videos where adults slip into a child mode very quickly. So it does still have its roots in popular culture and in our culture. But the beginnings of talking therapy, and I guess an outline of human personality.
And a strong link to cake, which is my takeaway from this. I'm a bit peckish now after this discussion. There is a handout on the id, the ego, and the superego. This is one of Rory's super duper handouts that he creates for topics that we discuss like this, and you can download that. It's free to download, and if you want to get the handout on id, ego, and superego, make your way to our website, which is counsellingtutor.com, and from the very top menu bar, click on the podcast tab and make your way to episode 205. That's 205. Right there in that page, you can get the download of the id, ego, and superego, as well as other links and a bit of a broadening of the discussion that we have here on the Counselling Tutor Podcast. So there you have it. That was our Counselling Foundations, and we move now into that focus on self, where we recognize that we as practitioners, we are the heart of our practice. We need to be there, and we need to be well within ourselves to be able to be there in service of others. And part of that, certainly in training, is a requirement that we should go into our own personal therapy. But of course, that is not just about in training. This can come up throughout the arc of our practice. In fact, our supervisors would keep an eye open for that restorative part of us. And if they recognized any need, they might suggest that we go into therapy again. And there are certain modalities, certainly, Rory, where one might remain in therapy for the entire arc of one's practice.
Yes, and before I go into that, I have to say that this is a topic that is perennially discussed in our Facebook page. And if you're not a member of our Facebook page, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. You'll find us. We're a closed group, but if you knock on the door, we're a friendly bunch. Our moderation team will let you in, and you can join thousands of like-minded people studying the world of counselling. We have students like yourselves and qualified practitioners like yourselves. We have supervisors. We also have tutors in there, all talking about the world of counselling and psychotherapy. And personal therapy comes up a lot because some people think, well, there's nothing wrong with me. Why should I go to personal therapy? But as Ken has alluded to, for some courses, certainly if you're doing psychoanalytical training, I believe you've got to be in therapy twice a week for the duration of the course. And part of it is because to understand and fully appreciate the model that you're taking, you need to understand what it's like from the client's perspective. But also training can open up so much for people. Ken and myself taught for a long time, 10 years, and I could tell you that people would come in and we would go through the models of therapy, and you could see people getting very, very highly in discomfort. And I think the reason for that is that their eyes were opened to what really was happening in their lives. As we explained the theories, they thought, oh my gosh, that's me. And people became, as we say in the counselling profession, a bit wobbly. And sometimes
I like that, Rory. I really love that.
Have a bit of a wobble.
Yeah.
Or even worse. I've worked with students we've taught lessons, and they've been completely broken just by us talking about the theory because it's opened up an old wound. So having your own therapy is really like a safety valve, and it's really, really, I think it's really, really important that students who are going through training, access their own therapy to be able to make sense of this new material, these new ideas, and their own history. So important.
Yeah, and when we look to why we enter on the journey to become a therapist, and ask yourself this question: why did you set out to become a therapist? And there is there is the concept of Chiron, the wounded healer, that many people go on the path of wanting to be there in service of others because they've maybe experienced some life-changing events or some difficulties in their own life, and they may have had a hand put out into the darkness that helped them through that, and then there's maybe a wanting to be there in service of others. But when we have a wounded part of ourselves that we take into this process, into this journey, it can remain there. I mean, the past doesn't go away. We can work through it, we can explore it, but as Rory has said, so often in the arc of training, something will come up where you might be revisiting your own life, your own past, and re-looking at those wounds that may still be sensitive, and going into therapy and really exploring that is highly, highly recommended, and I think in service of the clients that we see, and so often we would get students, speaking about us training together, Rory, that would go, why do I need to go into my own personal therapy? I've got nothing to take. Yes. And very interesting, you go into placement and you're working with a client, they might present with some kind of presentation, and the next thing you realize you maybe have quite a bit to take into own personal therapy. And you've got the personal therapy that might be a requirement of the course while training. We've kind of juxtaposed that against going into personal therapy while in practice. And I look back to my own journey and my own personal therapy, and I think I went in with the wrong attitude when I went into my own personal therapy. I went into my own personal therapy to see how it was done. And there is an element of that, to feel what it's like to be as the client. But it was almost right, let me see how a counsellor counsels. I'm going to go and pretend to be a client in a way to see how this is done. And I didn't take my full self into that therapy. I held back. I was more interested in the process and what the counsellor was doing than in my process, which is what therapy is about. And it took me some time into practice before I went into my own personal therapy again, and there I was able to bring my full self and gain the benefits of that therapy, and I'm glad that I did. And the other aspect of therapy that we might recognize is so often when somebody is entering therapy, it's because they are broken, because there are no other ways that they can see of getting out of where they are, because nobody else can understand them. But that's not always the only reason why we can go into therapy. Therapy can be incredible personal development. There's no reason to not go into therapy just to explore yourself a little deeper and to see what comes up for you in a therapeutic, professionally held space. So I think therapy has many uses, indeed, for a qualified practitioner and, of course, a student on that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things we have to be thoughtful of is and I've said this before on the podcast, we may meet ourselves in the therapy room. And this has happened to me. It's happened to students that I've taught. It's happened to colleagues, where you're working with someone and their experience is so close to yours that you could almost not separate yourself from them. And I think having your own personal therapy allows you the insight of self to be able to not to get caught up in that sort of parallel process, to be able to hold that space for the client, not for you. And I think that is really, really important. And also, you can't say this too kindly, really, but training is demanding. People who go on to practice-based training, it is very, very, very demanding. And students would say, well, what does that look like? And I'll say, well, I can't tell you because only you will find that out. And when students came to the end and they came towards graduation, they said, I never knew, Rory, just how demanding that was. And when you're talking of theories like attachment, we're talking about how abuse is played out, things like trauma bonding. All these things come up in professional discussion, and it's amazing. You can see students in the circle, their eyes lighting up as they realise, oh gosh, that's me. That's me. Yeah. And that is why we have the safety net of therapy. Definitely.
Yeah. And it's a great safety net to engage in. There's a strength in it as opposed to a weakness. And I think that sometimes clients, when they're coming in, go, oh, this is my last resort. I've tried everything. I'm not strong enough. I have to go to... We know, we are therapists, that there is a strength, a great strength in accessing therapy. And Rory and I... train supervisors. We have a supervision course. If you're interested in becoming a supervisor, go to counsellingtutor.com because the information is there. But within that course, self-care for the supervisee from the perspective of the supervisor, so important. We're looking out for the self-care of the practitioner. And that's what this focus on self whole section is about. It's about focusing on the heart of the practice, ourselves. And a supervisor would look out for, if something comes up in presentation at supervision, whether there may be a need or a benefit to taking that for the counsellor's or the supervisee's own therapy. And again, we spoke about the arc of training and how certain modalities require a student to be in training twice a week for the arc of training. That goes on way beyond training as well. There are certain modalities where you will remain in therapy. I certainly worked with a colleague who had been in therapy for more than 10 years and was going on a weekly basis and getting value every single time. And that was focus on self, not supervision, therapy, a therapeutic process that he himself was engaging in.
Yes. And some people go on therapeutic retreats. In the TA world, a retreat is or the psychoanalytical world, where people can go and focus on. It's not quite the same as personal therapy, but there is a personal therapeutic aspect to it. And as I say, in lots of training, certainly, if you're training in psychoanalytical training, twice a week, I think, and then ongoing for the entirety of the training, which I think is 5 or 6 years in some cases. It's quite intense training. So it is important. So if you're asked, as part of your course to have therapy, just maybe think about what's been discussed in this podcast, because it is, in my experience, it's super, super important.
Yeah. And I guess there's one last element that I'd love to touch on this, Rory, and that's the consideration of, do you tell the therapist that you reach out to that you are a therapist? And that's just a question in my mind at the moment. And I guess one of the things to watch out for is that the therapeutic world is a pretty small world. You want to be looking out for role confusion. One of the questions you certainly want to be asking if you are going into your own therapy as a therapist, so you're taking yourself in for personal therapy, is just check who the supervisor of the therapist is that you're going to make sure you don't share the same supervisor, because there would be a certain role conflict. But would you say that you are a therapist, Rory?
Well, I did when I went. I had my therapy, some more therapy, about 18 months ago, and I told my therapist I was a therapist. I have to say that that it was a bit of a shock to my therapist, but I said I'm not. I'm here to kind of not to be a therapist, but to be me, and to kind of try and get a sense of what's going on for me with a particular issue that I had. And I had to find it, once I disclosed that and we got past that, and the work was good, and I found it mightily helpful. I found it very, very helpful. Yeah,
I'm in the same camp as you, Rory, in that congruence is the best way to broach that. And then the other side of that coin is, how might you feel if you're a practicing practitioner? How might you feel if somebody presents for therapy and discloses to you that they are indeed a therapist? Would you feel okay about that? Maybe there's some work in looking at how you might be in that kind of situation. And I guess if you are okay, maybe there's an opportunity to list on your listing with your professional body that is a service that you offer. If I was reaching out, I might be drawn towards a therapist who might say, I'm happy to see fellow therapists for their own personal therapy.
Yeah.
That's maybe another string to the bow, another feather in the hat. I think this is an interesting and worth discussing topic. I think continue the conversation in our Facebook group. Rory's invited you. Just go to Facebook, put in Counselling Tutor, come and join tens of thousands of like-minded people. These are the kinds of topics that we discuss within that Facebook group. Discuss it with your peers. Journal about it. When last were you in your own personal therapy? Is there any merit in stepping in now? There you have it. So that is our focus on self for today. We now move on to Practice Matters, where we're discussing counselling training, how that differs from the United Kingdom to the United States of America. Rory, you met up with Robin Simmons to discuss this topic.
Yes, we had a wonderful time together, myself and Robin, chatting about the differences between training in the UK and training in the United States of America. And it is something, again, that comes up in our Facebook group. There seems to be a fascination with what counselling is like in America and the training is in America. So I asked her, and this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters.
And we welcome Robin Simmons, all the way from Alabama in the United States of America, a colleague from across the pond, who is going to talk about training in the US and how training in the US, and maybe we'll get on to how counselling in the US is different to counselling in the UK. So first of all, Robin, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm excited to be on your talk show.
Well, there we have it. So, so how does someone go about training to be a counsellor in America? And I think I'm right in saying that each state has a different legislator, different legislation. So in Alabama, how would someone go about becoming a counsellor?
So while that is true that each state regulates the licensure of counseling different, it is pretty similar across the U.S. how you get trained to be a counselor. And so the educational structure in the U.S. really is 13 years of elementary, middle, and high school. And then you can get an undergraduate degree either in 2 years or 4 years, associates and bachelors. And then a counseling degree is a master's degree. So you're in graduate school. You have to have had a 4-year degree to be able to move into a counseling degree. And then roughly it takes 2.5 years to graduate with that. And we have an accrediting body that is a national accrediting body that says you must have coursework in these particular areas. You have to have a 700-hour field experience in which the student is supervised at the university level as well as in practice in their community. And then there's other elements to that accreditation, but in terms of the preparation aspects of it, that's what our KCREP, it's called KCREP, stands for Council of Accreditation for Counseling and Related Educational Programs. Not all universities seek KCREP, but many licensure boards in the different states require degrees from KCREP or KCREP-like programs. And so we have a set of standards, and those standards include helping relationships information, which includes theories and skills and techniques, professional orientation and ethics. So we go over the code of ethics and train students in how to solve ethical dilemmas. We also talk about the professional roles that as a counselor, there's various places to work, which you said we may get to. There's also the idea I'm a professional counselor. So I have this identity as a professional counselor. And we train students to kind of think that way, wear their counselor hat. Social and cultural diversity is really important for our field, as well as understanding human growth and development and how all of those elements fit into that client that's sitting across from us. That when we're looking at that client, we have to consider their cultural context and their human growth and development context. Group counseling work, career development are also kind of skills and theories that we study. And then we train students how to do assessments, how to engage in testing to kind of figure out or ground our understanding of what clinical diagnoses they may be experiencing. And then research and program evaluation, not just how to understand the research, the professional literature that you find in journal articles, but also how to evaluate whether your individual counseling is effective, whether the programs you're running are effective, or if you're curious about, does this technique or intervention help with this clinical issue, just how to understand going about the process of conducting research. And so once a student has graduated with their degree, this is where it gets really complicated. This is what you're talking about, how it's regulated differently across the US. We find that there are different numbers of clinical hours from state to state. There are different tests that the counselor in training or the incoming counselor might take. And then there's different levels of licensure. For some states you just do the work or the required supervision and the clinical hours, and then you apply for licensure. Some states you have to get a junior license, and then you work directly under the supervision of somebody who is a board approved supervisor. But in general, I would say it takes about 2.5 to 3 years to get licensed in most states. That every state has some form of test that a counselor has to take to pass. And all states require some form of supervision. How it's regulated looks different. And even the term licensed counselor is different. And what's interesting is I started in a master's program in counseling in 1994. We are still having this same conversation of we need some form of uniformity. We need some form of being able to move across state lines and be able to set up shop as a counselor. And we just haven't arrived there yet. I do see that we've made some movement ahead, but it's been really small and it's really slow, and we're still not there yet.
I mean, it's fascinating to hear the statistic that I'm sure our UK audience will kind of reel at, if you like, is the 700 hours of clinical practice as a student. Most what we call placement hours, we would call that a placement here in the UK. Someone work for an organisation or a charity and accrue their supervised counselling hours. To qualify in the UK, it's a minimum of 100 hours to qualify. Some courses may ask for more, but generally speaking, it's 100 hours. So 700 hours. People listening to this will be saying, "Whoa, that's a lot of hours."
Yes, yes. And then to get the license, usually that's about 2,000 more hours. So they can be employable while they're getting their license. So they've got that 700. And then they have, depending on the state, some states have 4,000, some states have 2,000. So yes, a lot of hours to be able to hang a shingle and say that you are a licensed counselor and can deliver with the licensure laws. There's title law and practice law. So it's about what you call yourself and then how you can bill somebody for the services you provide. So that's really what is regulated, as well as, of course, the ethical practice of counseling.
Yeah. So there's a legislation around what title you can use. And there's also legislation around
yes.
how you can practice. So another question I know that the audience would be interested to have answered: do you in the UK we tend to teach either one modality? It's usually the work of Carl Rogers, or the transactional analysis courses that teach the work of Eric Byrne. There's integrative counselling, which would be Petruska Clarkson and other ideas. In training, is there single training modalities still in America, or is it an integrative kind of training that you would have?
Yeah, I think foundationally, the skills that we teach line up with person-centered. But we teach, on average, I would say most schools teach about 10 different theories. And of course, when you have one class that's covering 10 different theories, we don't teach any kind of purist model. But we do ask students to think about what theoretical orientation or what modality most resonates with them. And often we see people do integrative. And so I can't speak for all counselor educators, but for myself, it is really important for me that I teach them how to integrate, how to connect. If they say cognitive behavioral therapy is something that they really ascribe to, but they also see the value in existential counseling, I want them to know how to weave those together. Sometimes students because they're taking these classes before they actually see clients. So like when you think about those theories, you don't know what it looks like in practice. And I would say most counselor educators do engage in that sort of like, we're not teaching you how to align with one theory. We're teaching you how to understand each theory and perhaps how to interweave those theories. But it's kind of hard till you start seeing clients.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating, the differences. Is there one ethical body that oversees ethics? I mean, I know you have the American Psychological Association that seems to have quite a big voice in the world of psychology and psychotherapy. But over here we have in the UK and our friends in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, they have different ethical bodies. So we have about 5. There could even be more. There's quite a few. Is there just one in America, or are there a number of ethical bodies that people could ascribe to?
So we have the American Counselling Association, which is the overarching professional counseling association for us. And there are a code of ethics that are developed from that body. Most states also adopt that code of ethics. And then the states regulate, if you're licensed. The states regulate it. Now, if somebody wanted to file an ethical complaint against a practicing counselor, they can actually go through the American Counseling Association, or if they're licensed, through the State Counseling Association. Through the State Licensure Board. We also have state counseling associations. And then we have a body called the National Board for Certified Counselors, which is another regulating entity. So there's a difference between certification and licensure. Licensure, again, is about what you call yourself and what you can do in a given state. The NBCC is what we call it, but you can be a National Certified Counselor or an NCC. And it is an important credential, and it speaks to from many things, but one of the most important things for me is this national standard and somebody has met that, and most the tests that are aligned for licensure actually in most states originate from the NBCC. So there's also an ethical a set of ethics there. They all correspond to each other. So you might have your state board, your state counseling association, ACA, NBCC, but we're all saying the same thing. And we would not ascribe to the APA code of ethics because professional identity is really important. So we make sure that we separate out our identity from kind of our foundational, I don't know if you know this, but the counseling was originally a part of the American Psychological Association, and and formed our own professional counseling association, which was not ACA.
Just pause there again.
Time.
You just pause there. The reason is you just dropped out for a second. So start with.
Goodness.
So just start again with the separation. You say, I don't know if you knew this. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the 50s, counseling separated out from the American Psychological Association, and we developed our own counseling association, which is now the ACA, but it first started as the American Personnel and Guidance Association. So our foundations are really with vocational counseling and school counseling. And then in the 60s, our president at that time, John F. Kennedy, signed into law I'm totally blanking on it, an act, Community Mental Health Centers Act. And what happened then is we deinstitutionalized mental health cases. So up until that point, somebody who had a psychiatric illness, like a significant psychiatric illness, was essentially thrown into a state hospital and sometimes left there for long periods of time. But in the 60s, now we have these community agencies. And that's really what created the need for what we do as clinical mental health counselors.
It's really fascinating to hear some of the parallels that the American experience in mental health has with the UK. I mean, we had what was called Care in the Community in the 70s and 80s, where we looked at psychiatric hospitals, as they were called then, and realised there were people in there that were just left. And we had a programme of reviewing and closing them down and people being cared for in the community. So that's an interesting parallel. One question that always fascinates me, America is a very, very big country, as anybody with an atlas globe or map would know. And the recent pandemic, certainly in the UK, has seen counsellors go on to work online. And I'm sure the same things happened in the United States of America. But again, the state regulations are different, I believe. Am I right in thinking that someone in Alabama couldn't work with someone in California? Would that be right?
Yep, that's exactly right. So you can only, and again, this is where there's some variations among the states. So some states say you actually have to be physically present in the state where you're counseling someone in your state. Some states say, because sometimes counselors get licenses in various states. So I live fairly close to the Tennessee state line. So I could theoretically be licensed in Tennessee and Alabama. And if my state said I had to physically be in the state when I am working with that client, I would just have to jump back and forth between that. Some states don't regulate it that way. The client does have to be in the state for us to be able to see them. And it is really interesting that telehealth would seemingly open the doors for a counselor to be able to see someone across the US, but that is regulated. Again, it's about what you call yourself and what you can do to be paid within any given state.
I can't say what a joy it's been to spend time with you, Robin, and to see the difference. I think we've always talked about two nations divided by a common language, and I think that as sometimes just hearing about how another country's counselling system works is really, really interesting. But actually, I think we've got more in common than perhaps I thought at the time. Certainly with the approach to very serious mental health problems. So, Robin Simmons, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to Robin Simmons and to you, Rory, for hosting that interview. You have listened to episode 205 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
Yes, we started off with Counselling Foundations, the Sigmund Freud, the id, the ego, and the superego, and we even mentioned cake in that one. Our focus on self is starting your own personal therapy, and then we finished with Practice Matters, Training in America, an interview with American counsellor Robin Simmons. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
And eat cake. Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.